World champion, highest rated player of all time, and widely considered to be the GOAT of chess.
他怎么那么棒呀
Hello, this is YF Chess. We've been looking at Magnus Carlsen's games, and we've spotted a theme of him using zero development to demolish other top grandmasters. So in today's video, we're going to be breaking down zero development, and by the end, you will be able to play just like the world champion. If you believe that, no one can help you. For the rest of you though, keep watching to the end of the video and you'll be able to start using development. So the first example I've got for you guys is a game between Magnus Carlsen as black against world champion at the time Anand. And it's a very interesting position where Magnus is essentially hanging on by the skin of his teeth to stop checkmate. So white is threatening queen g7, but Magnus, being a fantastic defender, has his knight on e8 defending queen g7 checkmate. And that means Anand's secondary plan is rook f4 to rook h4 followed by queen takes h7 checkmate, which is pretty impossible to defend at the moment. The good news is Magnus has a couple of moves. Now, one other thing that I want to draw your attention to, this bishop on c8. So it's moved 26 and Magnus has not moved this bishop the entire game, and we'll come back to this in a moment. So Magnus here, he decides, okay, I need to create counterplay, and he plays fantastic move b2, tying down the rook. So now if the rook moves, Carlsen is just going to make a queen. But Anand, being Anand, fantastic attacking player, he decides, you can have the queen, I'm going to have your king, and continues with his plan. Okay, Carlsen makes the queen, and now Anand needs to decide how to block the check. He blocks with the knight, and now Carlsen finds a fantastic defensive move. So white's plan is rook h4. Magnus plays queen e1, and what it means is after rook to h4, he can simply play queen takes h4. So he loses the queen, but he gains a rook. He's effectively traded a pawn for a rook. So I believe Anand actually resigned after queen e1. But coming back a few moves here, after b1 equals queen check, Anand actually made a mistake here. He could have played bishop to f1. Now the difference is, after queen to e1, there's a knight in the way, so rook h4 is just going to win the game. So in this position, you need to find another defense. And the only other defense here is to do with bringing this queen back into the defense again, queen to d1. And after rook h4, queen to h5. And again, we're losing the queen, but because we're a queen up, that's alright. So after knight takes, pawn takes, rook takes, Magnus can just about hang on to the position with bishop f5. And once he defends the attack, he should be winning because he's a piece up. The other plan that white might have here is rook takes, pawn takes, and he would like to play knight f5 followed by knight e7 check. But the big problem here is, again, this bishop across this diagonal, he can just take the knight. So how is this relevant to zero development, and what is zero development? So a lot of chess players won't even understand the concept, because if you look up piece development on Google, the definition that comes up, so I've got a definition from chessstrategyonline.com, and it says moving your pieces out from their starting squares ready for battle. But that's not strictly correct. This bishop, although it hasn't been moved, it is developed. and this is the concept of zero development. Spending 0 moves on a piece, but having it already developed. And it's a very, very powerful concept because time, tempo is extremely important in chess. If you can develop pieces without spending any moves on them, then you're going to be at a big advantage. Okay, second example, guys. This time, Magnus Carlsen playing white against Azerbaijani Grandmaster Radjabov. And we're going to look through the whole game this time. So, standard stuff, e4, c5, fighting for the center. And knight f3, developing and controlling the center. Likewise for black. Bishop to e5, developing and also playing with the possibility of bishop takes c6, which will force black to damage his pawn structure, capture the pawn. So in this position, an inexperienced player might play a6, which is a mistake because black doesn't really want white to take anyway. So this way white's going to take, and black's effectively lost a move because a6 isn't a very useful move. Radjabov, being a super grandmaster, did not play a6, he played e6 instead. Now if white takes, which is an option, e6 is a much more useful move than a6. It opens up the bishop, and potentially you could even say it gives 0 development to this black bishop, f8. Now, after e6, Magnus did not take, castled, and in case you didn't know, in terms of openings, he's achieved a lot. So 3 main principles. Now, game continues with Radjabov playing knight g to e7, which is one of the ideas behind e6. Now, if bishop takes e6, black can simply recapture with the knight, and he gets to keep a wonderful pawn structure. So Carlsen plays c3, which is a dual-purpose move. One is possibility of preparing d4, but another one is to vacate the c2 square, which seems pretty random now, but actually it's very important because black's plan here, a6, d5. Now if the pawn was on c2, this bishop would actually be trapped. After bishop b3, c4, there's nowhere to go. Because Carlsen's got the c2 square, bishop comes straight back to c2, great square for the bishop. Radjabov develops bishop b7, likewise for Carlsen, queen to e2. And now Radjabov fights for the center with d5. Carlsen takes space with e5, and now ideally what Carlsen really wants to do, he wants to play d4. If he gets d4 in, he gets a fantastic space advantage, and this bishop actually also becomes a bad bishop because it gets blocked in pretty permanently by its own pawn, which is why Radjabov played a great move here, d4, not allowing Carlsen to set that up. Now in this position there's quite a obvious move that white wants to play, which is get 0 development for this bishop. You want to play the move e3, and that opens up this bishop, and there's also possibilities of moving out the bishop, but actually, like we discussed before, you don't necessarily need to move the bishop. There is a big problem with d3 though, which is that this bishop actually becomes a bit of an idiot, basically a tall pawn, but it gets blocked in by its own pawn, which is why in this position, before d3, Magnus plays bishop to e4. Now Radjabov continues with development, queen to b6. This is a potential weakness, so supporting the d4 pawn. Now continuing with the plan d3, rook to d8, again overprotecting the d4 pawn. Now, if we pause here for a moment and ask yourself the question, who is more developed here? If you go with the noob definition of development equals moving pieces, then blacks develop 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and whites develop 3. But the reality is, white is not at all behind in development, because this bishop is 0 developed. This is a fantastic bishop, and you'll see in a few moves. The other thing to keep in mind is that Carlsen is castled. So white's not behind in development at all. It's not about just moving pieces. And the final point is, in this position, Magnus finds a really wonderful move that enables 0 development for this rook on a1. So an inexperienced player here might play a move like bishop d2 or bishop f4 or bishop g5. But the thing with all of these moves, it doesn't actually improve your position. The bishop wants to be on this diagonal, right? Putting it on d2, maybe there's a very marginal improvement. You could even argue it's worse because it blocks the knight. This is not development. This bishop is already developed. This does not improve your position. Whereas Magnus's next move, a4, fantastic move. It essentially makes this rook go from 0 to hero. So black has a dilemma here. Either he allows this to open up, or he keeps it closed so that the rook doesn't get 0 development. But the problem with pushing this pawn is you lose control of a really, really big square on c4. And now a maneuver comes in which is pretty deadly. Knight d2, d4 to d6. It looks like black can win a pawn here, but the problem is this maneuver, knight c4 and then knight d6, is pretty much game winning. Black's either going to have to run with the king and then he loses an exchange to this fork, or he has to sacrifice the rook for the knight and his king's still stuck in the middle. So coming back to this position here, Radjabov decides he can't allow knight c4, he'll have to allow this 0 development for rook. So Radjabov plays knight d5, a takes, a takes. And now, as you can see, fantastic rook, fantastic bishop. 0 moves spent on the pieces, but developed. Now to continue, c takes d4, c takes d4. And again here, an inexperienced player would probably play bishop d2 or bishop g5. Looks a little bit better than bishop d2 because at least it attacks the rook. But after black just moves the rook, you haven't actually helped your position. The important thing for this bishop is to stay on this diagonal, because f4 is a particularly important square. This knight wants to come into f4. Now, if you continue with your development now, your bishop is worse on g5 than it was on c1. It can get kicked. And after it gets kicked, knight comes into f4. Fantastic square for the knight. So coming back to this position, Magnus recognized that. He leaves the bishop on c1. This is the piece that he wants to develop. He goes knight b to d2. Okay, it blocks the bishop, but it's only temporary. Knight f4, queen d1, knight b4. So Radjabov gets to knight f4, but when this knight gets to its destination on b3, suddenly the bishop is alive again, and Radjabov has to deal with this big threat. Bishop takes e4, so Magnus shouldn't take on f4 now, because after bishop takes f4 he's gonna lose a pawn on b3. So recapture this bishop and the knight is still under attack. Knight to d3, and now is the moment to play bishop g5, because now Radjabov is stuck with his rook. He plays rook d7. Well, if he wants to keep the pawn, he plays rook d7, but the problem is this 0 developed rook can now swing into action. Rook a8 is going to end the game. Just to come back, bam. Radjabov in this position played rook to d8. Now the d pawn drops, knight f takes 4. Radjabov grabs the pawn on b. Queen comes to e2, active square hitting knight and the pawn. Knight comes back to c4, trying to defend the d5 pawn. And now Magnus brings in his last piece, rook f to c1. And thanks to that zero development, that sequence of moves, white is now fully developed. Whereas for black, okay, this is kind of zero developed, but the king and the rook are far behind. So Magnus has a big development. Radjabov plays bishop c5, desperately trying to get developed and castle this time. But now Magnus has a beautiful tactic. Knight takes c5. The problem for Radjabov now is the natural capture of queen takes c5. Gonna lose to this zero developed rook again because of rook to a5. This knight is pinned, so Radjabov can't capture the rook. He has to move somewhere, and then he's going to use material. Knight on c4 is dropping. So in the game, Radjabov didn't recapture the knight, he tried to castle. Now Magnus simply takes another piece, and it's quite a crazy position. But essentially, Radjabov has no way to recapture any of the knights. So there's three possible captures. Queen takes b5, queen takes c5, and rook takes c5. If queen takes c5, this knight on c4 is the problem. So it looks like white can play queen takes c4, and now white's still a piece up. He's taking a knight and defending the knight c5. If queen takes 5, now he's put into a pretty nasty pin from the c1 rook. Now we just need to gang up on this c4 knight and do with knight to d6. There isn't any defense there for our c4 knight. And finally, if rook takes c5, there's a fork here using our bishop to 7, both the rook. So coming back to the game, Radjabov played knight takes c5, then after bishop e7, designed because he's using even more material after the piece down already. So if he wants to keep the rook, he has to play rook e8, but now the nasty fork comes in, knight. Okay guys, so to sum up, zero development is when we spend 0 moves on a piece, but that piece still becomes developed. How do we use that to up our game? Obviously it doesn't mean we keep all the pieces at home, but there's a few key takeaway points. Activate your pieces on their starting squares. These zero development usually applies to your long range pieces, queens, bishops and rooks. And we've seen in Carlsen's games how the bishop and rook can be extremely powerful on the starting squares. So just pushing up this pawn brings the c1 bishop into play. And this rook can come into play if you somehow open up this file. Another example I can think of for the queen very quickly will be a opening trap. So e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d3, knight f6, bishop e2. Now, black can take a pawn here, but e3, this move is a multi-purpose move. Not only is it supporting d4, but it's zero development for the queen. Because this diagonal has been opened, white has this fork, queen to a4 check, picking up the knight. Even though no moves have been spent on this queen is defending this e4 pawn. Number 2, development is not the same as movement. Development is bringing your piece into play. So if you move your piece into a worse square, or a square that is not better, that doesn't really classify as development. So to give you a bit of a silly example, in this position, this bishop is already 0 developed. Now a move might be bishop a3. That bishop is worse on a3, it's blocked in. That is not development and is a really, really bad move. Number 3, save tempo. If your piece is already 0 developed, look to develop other pieces. So coming back to this example, if your bishop on c1 is already 0 developed, don't move it again, get your other pieces out. After knight f3, now I have 2 pieces that are developed, the bishop and the knight. But if I were to play a move like bishop f4, I still only have 1 piece developed. Bonus tip, knights before bishops. Why? Knights on their starting squares, they control 3 squares. Whereas after you move the knight to a central square, you suddenly control 8 squares. That development improvement is huge. Compare that with a bishop. Your bishop, after opening up a diagonal, it controls a bunch of squares already. And also, you often want to keep some flexibility with this bishop in terms of where you want to go. With knights, 9 times out of 10 you want to go to this square. Most of the time you don't want to go to these 2 squares, they are worse off.